Folks, I think we will get ourselves started here. There's no formal introduction. Muzan's been making up stories for the last few weeks, and perhaps I should try to tell you, just don't believe half of them. I am a native of the state of Alabama. My family still lives there. I lived there for a grand total of 6 weeks and then moved with my family to Puerto Rico. My dad worked for the federal government and at the Air Force base in Aguadilla. And so I didn't move back to Alabama ever as a permanent resident, just as a student in the late 1960s. I did get my theological training at Emory, not Vanderbilt. I taught at Vanderbilt. My wife did her PhD work at Vanderbilt in religion. So that's how we got some of that confused. Pardon me? I just, like everybody growing up in the Southeast, you kind of learn to play football. And I didn't learn that it was dangerous until I injured myself and took a year to rehabilitate an injured leg. And then actually in 1997, I had my neck rebuilt. So those are all things that I'm afraid that I've had to put up. I will tell you that perhaps the finest teacher I've ever worked with was my college football coach. Coach Bryant was an extraordinary teacher, and I hope I have taken some of that into the classroom. A short story about that, and then we'll get into the lesson. After I had hurt my knee and was no longer able to play, my teammates were involved in a game on New Year's Day with Texas A&M, a Cotton Bowl game. And the coach of the Cotton Bowl team for Texas A&M was a fellow named Gene Stallings. And Coach Stallings had played for Coach Bryant at A&M. Toward the end of the ball game, it was A&M was leading, and it was one of those occasions where we had to deal with whether or not one of Coach Bryant's pupils, his protégés, actually would beat him. That had never happened before. The game ended, Texas A&M won, and Stallings won. And Coach Bryant went sprinting out to the middle of the field. Those of us on the sidelines, and once you're part of that family, even if you're hurt, at least they used to let us stand on the sidelines and look like we were important. Coach Bryant started running out to the middle of the field. We were petrified. What's the old man doing? He gets to Coach Stallings and lifts him up on his shoulders and carries him off the field. Then gets in the locker room and tells us, when you've taught someone to be better than you are, you've been successful. I got beat by a better coach. You guys hold your heads up. I lost. You didn't. I have never forgotten that, and I've thought about what we do in a classroom or in a room like this is we look for ways to help people push back and understand better than we do. And when you're working with students, it often comes in the form of questions. And the real temptation as a teacher is when you get challenged, a student asks you a question you don't know, you cover. You sound like you know more than they do. You quote footnotes and you confuse people, right? And you get them lost, and it's all a strategy to avoid the fact you don't know what you're talking about. Well, the real joy is when you're able to simply say, nah, that's not what I need to do. I need to find a way to pick my student up on on my shoulders and carry him or her off the field. Let's make a transition this way. What's a goy like me doing with a subject like the Holocaust? Now, that may be even too inside a line to use. A goy is a Gentile. What's a Gentile like me doing with a subject like the Holocaust? Why am I so compelled to deal with this topic? What I want to do for the next 3 weeks with you is to talk about what I would call the Christian problem of the Holocaust and help you enter into the issues that challenge me. But probably the best way to start that process is for me to give you a little background on why I'm so taken and compelled by this. In fact, I think what you would find is that my story is like many other people's story in terms of how they have gotten involved in a topic like this. And so it won't be so idiosyncratic. Essentially, there are 4 trajectories for me. The first one is the influence of the person who directed my doctoral committee at Emory University. I was involved in a program that was in its first year of experimentation. Now there are lots of people with doctors of ministry, but this was the first year. So I chose someone who would be very much like a college football coach. I chose a German theologian to push me. And in the process, I discovered all sorts of things that were rich and rewarding. But I discovered that this person whom I admired was just as captured by these dynamics of anti-Jewish, anti-Semitic sentiment. At some point after my program was all over, we were sitting having lunch, and he made a casual comment that simply shocked me. I won't repeat it, but I will tell you I never expected to hear it. It was one of those things that as soon as you hear it, you think, how in the world could you even think about another human being that way? And as soon as he said it, he knew he had said it. And he couldn't take it back. And we talked a little bit about the fact that this was a part of his identity for which he still bore a great pain, and that he hoped I would always understand the power of language and the power of cultural socialization, to cut into your values this way. So that's one strand for me, my relationship with Manfred Hoffmann. Another strand is I began in college reading a man by the name of Elie Wiesel. And Elie Wiesel is someone that you've heard Muzan quote. Many of you may have read his book Night, or perhaps others of his books. I started with a book called Town Beyond the Wall. I only got to Night after 3 or 4 books, and I was captivated. This was a man who wrote about the darkest period that I could think of in human history, and he wrote about it in ways that were compelling and rich and layered with meaning. Eventually, I was in charge of a program in Berea, Ohio at Baldwin Wallace College, where I was the chaplain. And it was a 3-year grant-funded program, and it ended with Elie Wiesel coming to campus and I had the chance to meet someone who had become terribly important for me. Well, you might guess. I did what a lot of people do. I got so excited. I got everything out of perspective. Finally, I realized I'm just the host. Get everything back down to order. So I played the host role. We had a wonderful program. And then after it was all over, Pam, you'll remember this vividly, I asked if he'd like to come to our house for a cup of tea. He said yes. And Pam Knight panicked. She bolted home with a close friend and proceeded to throw everything that was lying around in the living room and dining room under the sofa. Giselle came home. We visited, and while I was off in the kitchen preparing some tea, she mentioned I had written a song that was expressing one of the scenes in Night. Ellie wanted to hear it, and it was one of those moments where things either were confirmed or I would be thoroughly embarrassed for the rest of my life. As it turned out, a wonderful friendship has developed. We've been guests in each other's classes. We stay in touch. And he has encouraged me, and it's particularly with one sentence. He wanted to know why I wasn't publishing my thoughts in this area. Because at this time, in 1982, anything I had written about the Holocaust was private. I simply said, who am I to talk about this topic? I'm a white Anglo-Saxon man born in 1948. I'm a Methodist minister. What have I got to say about this? His response was simple. Who are you not to? I haven't been able to escape that since. So that's trajectory number 2. Trajectory number 3 involves a man named Franklin Littell. He wrote a book called The Crucifixion of the Jews, which he published in 1975. I read it right after it came out, and I was overwhelmed by what I discovered. I had learned about the Holocaust through Wiesel. But what I didn't know was the rest of the story in terms of the Christian side of things. There was a 1900-year history of a dark shadow side of Christianity that laid the groundwork for the attitudes in Europe, particularly for Christendom. One of the best ways I can illustrate it is to tell you I learned that every law the Germans passed, except the definition of what it means to be a Jew, was not anything new. They had all been taken almost word for word off of church canon law books. The church had already invented these things. An example. We know about the yellow star that Germans made Jews wear. The church made Jews wear a yellow circle. At the beginning of the 9th century, and officially it was legislated in the Fourth Lateran Council in 1215. Now that's the same council that legislated the definition of the Eucharist and the teaching of transubstantiation. It's pretty sobering. So Franklin Littell, trajectory 3. He's since become a very important friend and mentor. He founded the first Scholars Conference. It met to talk about this topic. It met for the first time in 1970. They've been meeting every March for what is that, 37 years. I'll get my math right. Then trajectory number 4 is my father. I grew up with a parent who wouldn't talk about World War II. When my friends would talk at school and I would come home and ask, he would say, if you had seen what really happened, you couldn't talk about it. And so only as an adult did I begin to learn things. I learned that my father worked for a man named General Lucius Clay, who was the head of military government in Berlin immediately after the war. I learned that my father was responsible for the program where Germans were required to visit former concentration camps. And those visits, you will remember, were filmed. The reason for that, General Eisenhower was afraid that someone would think the Allies made this stuff up. So in order to prove that this all happened, General Eisenhower in 1945 required filming of these camps and the visitation of these camps by German citizens. Now, my father was the man in the office who had the job of actually carrying out the assignments and figuring out how to get people to those places. So, 4 trajectories, and they all come together almost by accident. And I find myself compelled to deal with this event. But as I work with it, I discover that it is more than just a personal sense of urgency. I discover that I'm looking at an event that has changed the shape of how we think about our world. It's an event that requires us to think there's a before Auschwitz and an after. It's a touchstone event. That things were decidedly different for all of us after we learned what happened. Let's see if I can try to characterize this a bit. The Reformation meant that redefined how Christians understood themselves in relationship with each other. And most of us are very much aware that this is one of those events where before the Reformation and after the Reformation, Christianity is decidedly a different kind of entity. But the people who experienced the Reformation probably weren't walking around thinking, oh, I'm in the midst of the Reformation. You don't know you're in a world-shaking event while it's going on. You only know after. Well, this is the same magnitude of an event. It redefines all sorts of relationships. The Roman Catholic Church developed a document in 1965 called Nostra Aetate, redefining how it understood its relationship to non-Catholic Christians and Jews and people of other religious traditions. Now, as Protestants, we may not think that's a big deal, but that document affected all of us. And we've all been involved in rethinking how we relate to others. And this congregation, I'm proud to say, is one of those congregations that practices this on a regular basis. When you're involved in a touchstone event like that, it means that you've got a number of things going on that you have to deal with. And let me try to illustrate these and give you something you can take with you. And I'm going to turn to one of my favorite theologians of all time. He's an Elizabethan bard, actually. His name is William Shakespeare. Most of you don't think of him as a theologian, but I don't know how it gets any better than this statement. This goodly frame, the earth, seems to me a sterile promontory. This most excellent canopy, the air, look you. This brave o'erhanging firmament, this majestical roof fretted with golden fire, why, it appears no other thing to me than a foul and pestilent congregation of vapors. Oh, what a piece of work is a man. How noble in reason, how infinite in faculty and form and moving, how express and admirable. In action, how like an angel. In apprehension, how like a god. Dripping with irony, isn't it? Now, do you remember? Well, we're not going to have a quiz, but maybe you'll remember Hamlet well enough to know that this scene came early in Act 2. The ghost of Hamlet's father had been wandering around the castle, and one night explained to Hamlet, you remember what? You're not used to Muzan asking you to talk back? What did the ghost tell Hamlet? Who what? His uncle killed his father. And with whose help? His mother. Now, Hamlet was already distraught over the death of his father. And then he discovered his uncle and his mother had colluded in the deal and poisoned his father. Now, I would like to suggest to you that's an image that can help us understand what's at stake for people who look at the... Hamlet's undergoing a crisis of several layers. One of them is simply the grief over losing his father. Another is, it's complicated. His father isn't just his father. His father's the king. So it's the sovereign of his whole world. Third, he's discovered members of his own family have participated in killing his father. Now, this is the sort of thing that happens when you study an event like the Holocaust. You discover that along with Jews, Christians have a sense of the loss of this sovereign who's in charge of history, because somehow all of this evil happens to people and God doesn't act. And the one place that it gets focused most powerfully is with the 1.5 million children under 12. Not the adults, the children who were slaughtered again and again and again. And you realize the best understanding of that pain is found in the book of Job, because Job has experienced the same thing, the loss of his children and the fracturing of his understanding of how God works in the world. Now, what I want to say here is this doesn't mean that God has died, but it may mean that our understandings of God shattered. There's a big difference. We have notions that God is like a super parent or like Hamlet's father, the king of the domain and always in charge. And the Holocaust is one of those events that rattles our cages and suggests maybe it's not like that. Either that, or there's some cruelty in this picture that I don't know what to do with. And it's focused in the children, because the Germans killed, or the Nazis killed, those 1.5 million children because of the faith of their grandparents. It had nothing to do with anything they did. So they were slaughtered for being faithful, not their parents, their grandparents. And there's something that just isn't right about that. But it gets complicated for us once we start studying the history. It's like my reading of Franklin Littell. I discover in my history there are all of these trails and laws and attitudes that are embodied not just at the margins of Christianity, but at the heart. And it's almost like Hamlet realizing his uncle and his mother participated in the deed. Are you with me here? You discover, the more you love your church, the more you love Christianity, the more this hurts. Because you can't dodge the history. You discover that in 1546, Martin Luther preached a sermon in which he called on Christians of his day to go out and burn synagogues with people in them. It wasn't some kook, it was Martin Luther. Or you discover that the theology of contempt that Jews saved as a negative witness for Christians, that teaching goes back to somebody named Augustine. And you begin to wonder, how do I work with all of this? And I submit to you, it's not unlike Hamlet's dilemma. He discovered the poisoning was in his own house. So for those of us Christians who face this, it becomes a major identity crisis. That's why I said it's like the Reformation. It has that kind of character to it. One of the things that we discover is that in this history Christians have with Jews, there are things called the Inquisition, the Crusades. Most of us know that. But there are also things like the teaching of blood libel, that for hundreds of years Christians taught that Jews killed Christian children and took their blood to make Passover bread, matzah. and that this is still believed in some parts of the world and still taught. So these sorts of things are sobering. Let me read an excerpt from a story called The Last of the Just. I think it captures some of the disjointedness that leads people who study this topic into its domain. It's written by Andre Schwartzbart, and it's in this scene there are two lovers, Golda and Ernie. They have been preparing to get married. They're engaged. They're deeply in love, but they're being deported to Auschwitz. "Oh, Ernie," Golda said, "you know them. Tell me, why? Why do the Christians hate us the way they do? They seem so nice when I can look at them without my star." Ernie put his arm around her shoulder solemnly. "It's very mysterious," he murmured in Yiddish. "They don't know exactly why themselves. I've been in their churches and I've read their gospel. Do you know who the Christ was? A simple Jew like your father, a kind of Hasid." Golda smiled gently. "You're kidding me." No, believe me, and I'll bet they'd have got along fine, the two of them, because he was really a good Jew. You know, sort of like the Baal Shem Tov, a merciful man and gentle. The Christians say that they love him, but I think they hate him without knowing it. So they take the cross by the other end and make a sword out of it. And then they strike us with it. You understand, Golda? He cried suddenly and strangely excited. They take the cross and they turn it around. They turn it around. Oh my God. Now, most of us haven't lived in that intensely sharpened an environment. That's more of a characteristic of what Eastern European Jews would have experienced. My first taste of meeting and visiting with someone for whom that was literally his experience was in 1995. I'd gone over to participate in the anniversary, 40th anniversary. Is that right? Yes. 50th anniversary, I'll get it right, of the liberation of Auschwitz. And my travel plans meant that I had to go and stay late on a program I was participating in. But it also meant I was going to sleep on a cot in a person's kitchen. And this particular person was a survivor of Auschwitz. And he had been one of the children. If you saw the movie Schindler's List, you remember there was a scene where they put children on a transport in that Ploshchov camp. And they went out, and one of the children was hiding in a latrine. It's a powerful scene in the movie. Well, as those children were taken out, one of those children jumped out of the transports and escaped. This was my friend. And I stayed on this cot, and he would walk me around Krakow and tell me things. And one of our walks, we were on a street, and there was a Roman Catholic church on the other side. And he just simply casually said, during your Holy Week, I couldn't walk on the street and go to town. Because if I walked anywhere near that church, I would be beaten by the people who had been to church and been told that my people had killed Christ. And what struck me about this was the fear in 1995 that this man still felt for a church. And I couldn't imagine being afraid of a church. Now that's the sort of thing that kind of rumbles around. And how I would characterize it is by saying you've got an extended identity crisis that involves a crisis we share with Jews, how we understand God after the Holocaust. We have to become more thoughtful, more reflective. We've got to think about what does it mean to say God is active in history with us. And secondly, we have to understand and work with our own history with regard to our relationships with Jews. And it has two dimensions. It's the history of the church during the middle of last century, when the church didn't protect Jews, particularly in Europe. And also the history of the church from the very earliest times all the way up to the present. So it's a combination of things. We share a dilemma with Jews about the shape of covenant faithfulness, and we don't share a problem with them with regard to how we understand our relationship with Jews and others. And we have to work all this out. Now, what I propose doing with you is next week and the week after, taking each of those problems. We'll look at the theological dilemma next week. And I'll explore some models that I hope will help us think about ways to do this. And then the next week we'll look at how do you live with a history that's broken and wounded. And let me give you some clues, because there may be some others of you that I think I'd rather go to another Sunday school class for the next 2 weeks. So I've got you now. I'll give you some hints of where we're going. In terms of the theological models, I would ask you to think about the metaphor of hospitality. We'll explore it more. But one of the things that happens when you think about how does God relate to history is you have to give up this magical notion that God sits outside of history and zaps into it and withdraws and re-enters and withdraws like a sovereign monarch who says, do that, do that. Now, that sounds awfully simplistic, but probably most of us have some version of that theology operating for us. It's just a little more sophisticated. We pray and we think God enters into our world and maybe works through our own hands, but God's outside history and is called into history by our prayers. But what if our history unfolds in the life of God instead? What if God is never outside of history at all? What if it's all about recognizing a different way of participating in the life of God, and that the key for us is to make room for God to be with us because God's already there. But we have to make room. We have to do it by an act of hospitality. And the interesting thing is maybe that's what God has been doing from the beginning. making room for creation, making room for all of us, making room for life. It's not a matter of God setting something in motion and withdrawing. It's a matter of God actively being the host of all life, welcoming every form of life and otherness that can be. And that from the beginning, creation has been a wager that relationship and life are worth it. And you know, I think that's what the book of Job was all about. But it took Job some deep struggling to find it out. Well, that's one direction we'll go. Another direction is to look at how do we deal with a problematic history for ourselves. Imagine let's see. Let me turn it on myself. I told you earlier, I was born in Alabama. I went back to Alabama for my college education. I went back in 1966. I went to college in 66, which meant I went to the University of Alabama 2 years after George Wallace stood in a doorway. Do you remember? What that meant was, in a student population of 20,000, we had less than 20 African American students on my campus. What it meant was this young man who had moved in 1963 from South Carolina to the Washington, D.C. area, had experienced an integrated world, had developed friendships and thought, I'm beyond all of that. I've worked all of this out. It meant I went back to college and was blind to everything that was going on all around me because I thought it was all about and only about attitudes of prejudice. I didn't understand that it also had a structural dimension too. So I wound up playing football at a school where when I went shopping downtown, our pictures were on 8x10 glossies in lots of the stores. I had a 20% discount at most any place I shopped. I didn't pay for a movie for a long time. Those are rules that have changed, you know. Oh, this was even the most embarrassing part. We even had a men's store that gave us all silk underwear that had on one leg UA and on another leg our initials. It's a world that treats you like you're just on a pedestal. And so you quit seeing all sorts of things. Well, in February 1968, I had an afternoon free. I only had maybe a handful of afternoons free in 4 years. And this afternoon, I volunteered with a Wesley Foundation and went with a friend named Violet Carroll out to a hospital, a mental hospital for adults. And we spent 3 hours with a man who thought he was Marty Robbins. You know who Marty Robbins is? You have to be a little older or a really diehard country fan. But this man not only thought he was Marty Robbins, he sounded like Marty Robbins. And he sang out in the West Texas town of El Paso. He sang El Paso over and over and over. And when we were finished, we were we had memorized El Paso and we could sing it. And we were emotionally drained. And I said to Violet, let's go to the Quick Snack, one of those places where I had signing privileges. Whenever I'd go in, I'd get some food, I'd sign the back of the bill, and then put it in the cash drawer. And every 6 weeks or so, I'd go in and I'd pay my bill. I just thought that was normal. This time I went in, I ordered 2 ice cream cones, one for me, one for Violet. And they told me in Quick Snack, my bill was due. My bill really was due. We walked out. I was embarrassed because I didn't have the cash that day. I had to fish around and found an old check, a blank check in my wallet. Violet looked at me and said, "Welcome to my world." Violet was one of those handful of African American students at the University of Alabama. I was blind to this. This is my shadow history. I'm a white Southern boy. I may have only lived a short period of my life in the Deep South, but that's my history. That's my identity. And I can't ever run away from it. What I can do is figure out how to face it. And in learning how to face it, it becomes a part of me that helps me walk with some measure of humility. Now, what I will tell you is that I turned to that history when I gave a talk on dealing with that shadow history in Berlin in March of 1995. Because the thought that I had was, how do I talk about this to Germans and tell Germans about their history? It'll sound like this whippersnapper coming over from the United States pointing fingers at them. The only way I could do it from my perspective was to talk about me. But the history I knew of that kind of prejudice and race was mine, not theirs. Now, it doesn't mean I'm not proud of being from Alabama. It doesn't mean I'm not proud of my own family. They're just as colonies too. It just means I have to embrace them with a measure of understanding that it's all a wounded world. And hospitality to the other helps make that possible. And a particular story from Genesis helps me tremendously. And I think that's the one I want to close with. And let you think for a week about, where's this guy going to go next week? In Genesis 32. Let's see. I bet there's some old Baptists in here who might be able to remember sword drills. Anybody know what Genesis, don't peek in your Bible. Genesis 32, what's it about? Anybody remember? Jacob at the Jabbok. What's that about? Got it. When Jacob wrestled with God. However, the text doesn't say Jacob wrestled with God directly. And this is where the text is wonderful. Some of you have already turned to it. Jacob has been estranged from his brother Esau for 20 years. Why? He stole his brother's birthright. He was the younger by a few minutes to Esau. And in stealing his brother's birthright, his brother had said, anybody remember? Going to kill you. His mother helped him get away. And for all Jacob knew, when he returned, Esau still wanted to kill him. So as he made his way back, he had sent a big gift of people and animals ahead to appease his brother. And he was all by himself, sent his family on because he was afraid something might happen to them too. And so he went to sleep on a riverbank, the Jabbok. And during the night, an Ish came. It says in the New Revised Standard, a man came. Ish is the Hebrew word for man. Now, that's important. It doesn't say an angel came. It says an Ish. But it doesn't tell you who the Ish was. And they wrestled through the night. Day began to break. And the Ish said to Jacob, let me go, for day is breaking. Right? And Jacob said, I won't let you go unless you tell me your name. And the Ish didn't respond to that. The Ish instead said, well, why do you want to know? What's your name? And Jacob said, Jacob. And already Jacob started to change. Jacob's been one who, until this time, was a trickster. But think about it. He answers honestly to the one he's wrestling with. And he quits playing the games enough to say, I'm Jacob. And then the Ish says to Jacob, no more shall you be known as Jacob, but Israel. For you have striven with gods and human beings, and you have prevailed or survived. And then the Ish disappears, and Jacob leaves, but there's something that happens to Jacob who's now become Israel. How does he leave? He leaves limping. And he names not the Ish, but what does Jacob name? He names the place. Penuel or Peniel. In Hebrew, it's the same word because it's just 3 letters, the P, the N, and the L. And you have to put in the vowel mark. That's why it's confusing. Penuel or Peniel. Either way, it's the same word. It simply means face of God. Think about it. In facing up to whatever or whoever that Ish was, Jacob came to terms with that shadow history of betrayal and collusion with his sibling and himself and his father his mother, and he became a new person, named by the other Israel. But Israel is only Israel if Israel limps. And then he named only the place for the encounter. Now, if you read further, you'll discover that the Scriptures will call him Jacob all over again, and especially when Jacob doesn't live up to his promise. He said when he met Esau, I'll meet you back at Seir, and Jacob didn't show up. Now, ask yourself, why is Jacob sometimes Jacob and sometimes Israel? Maybe it's as simple as Jacob's Jacob when Jacob doesn't limp. Jacob's Israel when Israel limps. And then think about the entire Hebrew Scriptures. It's a record of a people whose walk with God is wounded. It's a record of people limping. Why? Why would a people tell their story of being God's people and tell you over and over and over again how they messed up? Doesn't it make sense that if you're really proud of who you are, you'd talk about all the ways you didn't mess up? But why do they remember messing up? Perhaps to remember that they limp. Oh, and there's a little word play here that if you read Hebrew would just tickle your fancy. We know the word law. Jews follow the law of God. But in Hebrew the word law is halakha. And halakha is the noun form of the verb lech, which means to walk. So, literally, law means way of walking. Limping is a wounded way of walking. What does God require of you? Do justice, love kindness, and walk humbly with your God. Oh, dear friends, what is walking humbly if not limping? Now, I would suggest to you that post-Holocaust Christians are people who also know how to limp. It means we can continue walking, but it's rooted in humility. But we always have to remember the wounding, because if we don't, we'll act like we don't limp. We will lose our humility. Well, this is an introduction of what the tasks are for post-Holocaust faithfulness. The Holocaust is not just a Jewish problem. It's also a very important Christian problem. And I'm proud to be a person who participates in a church that understands that our faithfulness must grapple with these kinds of things. Would you join me in a short prayer? May the words of my mouth, the meditations of our hearts, be acceptable in your sight, O Lord, our rock and our Redeemer. And may they be credible in the presence of the children who perished during the Holocaust. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Thank you.